Imagine a boardroom on a Tuesday morning. The air is thick with the scent of expensive coffee and the palpable electricity of a multi-billion-dollar empire at its peak. On the mahogany table sits a single press release, a document meant to revolutionize the industry, to squeeze every last drop of profit from a loyal user base that had nowhere else to go. Or so they thought. In that moment, the executives weren't looking at a countdown, but the clock had already started. Within 72 hours, the stock would be in freefall, the CEO would be in hiding, and a brand built over decades would be nothing more than a case study in a marketing textbook. This is how you destroy everything you've ever built in 3 days. It didn't start with a product failure or a massive data breach. It started with the one thing a corporation can never recover from: pure, unadulterated arrogance. The first hour was deceptively quiet. When the announcement hit the wire at 9 a.m., the internal sentiment was one of triumph. They had found the infinite growth glitch. By changing a few lines in their terms of service, they were essentially turning their customers into digital sharecroppers. The math on the spreadsheets looked beautiful. If even half of their users stayed, the company's valuation would double by the end of the fiscal year. They expected a few grumbles, perhaps a handful of angry tweets from the usual detractors, but they relied on the inertia of the masses. They believed people were too lazy to switch, too integrated into the ecosystem to leave, and too small to fight back. This was the first and most fatal mistake. They forgot that in the digital age, a spark doesn't need a forest to start a fire. It only needs a single, well-placed screenshot. By hour 6, the temperature in the room had shifted. The internet isn't a monolith, but when it finds a common enemy, it develops a terrifying, singular consciousness. The technical community, the power users who had been the backbone of the brand's credibility, were the first to dissect the fine print. They didn't just see a price hike, they saw a betrayal of trust. They found the hidden clauses, the retroactive charges, and the predatory language that the PR team had tried to bury under layers of corporate jargon. The grumbles the board expected turned into a roar. Influencers who had spent years praising the product were now making "Why I'm Leaving" videos. The narrative was no longer about a business update, it was about a villainous overreach. Yet, inside the headquarters, the response was a shrug. They called it temporary noise. They told the social media managers to stick to the script and wait for the news cycle to move on. They didn't realize that they weren't the ones in control of the cycle anymore. Hour 12 marked the transition from a PR problem to a business crisis. The first major partners began to distance themselves. These weren't just users. These were the heavy hitters, the companies that provided the ecosystem's legitimacy. A short, 3-sentence statement from a key collaborator expressed deep concern. In corporate speak, this is the equivalent of a declaration of war. Suddenly, the infinite growth spreadsheet looked a lot less certain. The internal Slack channels, once filled with congratulatory emojis, were now silent or buzzing with anxiety. Mid-level managers began asking what the contingency plan was. The answer was terrifying. There wasn't one. The leadership was so convinced of their own genius that they hadn't even considered the possibility of a plan B. They were flying a plane into a storm with no radar and no parachutes, convinced that if they just kept a steady hand, the clouds would eventually part. As the sun rose on the second day, the 24-hour mark, the stock market opened. The opening bell sounded like a funeral toll. The price didn't just dip, it gapped down. Investors don't care about corporate vision when they smell blood in the water. They saw the partner exits, they saw the viral boycotts, and they saw a leadership team that was eerily silent. Panic is more contagious than any virus, and by noon on Wednesday, the sell-off was in full swing. This is the moment where most companies would issue a humble, heartfelt apology. They would roll back the changes, fire a scapegoat, and beg for forgiveness. But arrogance has a way of doubling down when it's cornered. Instead of an apology, the company issued a clarification. It was a masterpiece of condescension. It essentially told the users that they were too stupid to understand the new policy, and that if they just looked closer, they'd see it was actually for their own benefit. It was like pouring gasoline on a volcano. Hour 36 was the point of no return. The clarification was picked up by mainstream news outlets. It wasn't just a niche industry story anymore. It was a front-page disaster. Late-night hosts were making jokes about the company's greed. Competitors, sensing the kill, began offering migration discounts for anyone jumping ship. The data showed a mass exodus of historical proportions. People weren't just threatening to leave. They were deleting accounts in droves, wiping years of data just to make a point. The company's servers were struggling to keep up with the requests to vanish. The internal culture began to fracture. Employees, who felt their own reputations were being tarnished by association, started leaking internal memos to the press. These leaks revealed the true nature of the boardroom discussions, the disdain for the customers, the calculated greed, and the utter lack of empathy. The mask was gone, and what was left underneath was hideous. By the start of the third day, the 48-hour mark, the board of directors finally panicked. They bypassed the CEO and called an emergency meeting. The office was no longer a place of triumph, it was a bunker. The CEO, who 48 hours ago was being hailed as a visionary, was now being asked for a resignation. The stock had lost a third of its value. Legal teams were warning of class action lawsuits that could last a decade. The brand's trust score, a metric they had spent millions to cultivate, had plummeted to the lowest level ever recorded for a company of its size. They finally realized that the inertia of the masses they relied on had actually worked against them once the masses started moving away. There was no force on Earth that could stop their momentum. The final 24 hours were a blur of desperate damage control. They finally issued the real apology, the one they should have sent in the first hour. They promised to reverse every single change. They promised to fire the executives responsible. They promised to donate to charity and listen to the community. But the problem with burning a bridge while you're still standing on it is that there's nowhere left to go but down. The community didn't want an apology. They wanted a corpse. The trust was so thoroughly shattered that even the reversal was viewed with suspicion. People assumed it was just a temporary retreat until the heat died down. The partners didn't come back. The stock didn't bounce. The competitors didn't stop their aggressive poaching. The 72-hour mark arrived not with a bang, but with a hollow silence. Looking back, the destruction of the company wasn't caused by the policy change itself. Plenty of companies raised prices or changed terms without imploding. The destruction was caused by the reaction to the reaction. It was the refusal to acknowledge the humanity of their users, the belief that they were uncancelable, and the pathological need to be right even when the world was telling them they were wrong. They spent 10 years building an empire, and 72 hours proving they didn't deserve it. The building still stands, the name is still on the door, but the company that existed on Tuesday morning is dead. It was killed by the very thing that made it successful in the first place. The unwavering belief that they knew better than everyone else. In the end, the most expensive thing you can own is an ego that you can't afford to feed. This wasn't just a failure of PR, it was a failure of soul. And as the final seconds of that third day ticked away, the only thing left for the survivors to do was sift through the ashes and wonder how something so big could feel so small in the face of a collective no. The 72 hours were over, but the ghost of that disaster would haunt the halls forever. A permanent reminder that in the world of business, you are only as strong as the trust you haven't yet broken. If you ever find yourself in a boardroom on a Tuesday morning, looking at a plan that prioritizes profit over people, remember this story. Remember that the clock is always ticking, and once it hits zero, there is no going back. The fall isn't what kills you, it's the sudden stop at the end of the third day.